All right, everybody. Hello, hello. Let me start with the PowerPoints, even my self-introduction, even as our audience is still coming in. So it's November 7th, 2023, unbelievably. And it's at least that it is in San Diego. Ohayou gozaimasu to Japan, where it is November 8th, 2023. And I have today with me Dr. Mireya Solís from the Brookings Institution. And we'll talk about Japan's quiet leadership, Reshaping the Indo-Pacific, which is her new book. Before we begin the conversation, allow me to tell you a little bit about ourselves. Yes, it's the Japan Zoominar. I'm Ulrike Schede, professor and director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. I work at this wonderful university, UC San Diego. And at UC San Diego, we are GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. There are some numbers there. The most important information from the slide might be that we offer a degree in international affairs with a Japan specialization. So if you're interested in our offerings, please visit gps.ucsd.edu. And then JFIT is our Japan Center, and you can follow us at the various social media or go to jfit.ucsd.edu. Our events are recorded, so if you've missed one in the past, for instance, the one that Dr. Solís was on about 2 years ago, you can go back and listen to that if you go to our JZ gallery. So in this event, including, there's a recording of that in our website. So what that means is that in order to protect your privacy, I will refer to you only by your first name if and when you write up a question. So throughout this event, please type your Q&A into the button, and I will make sure to see whether I can tie this into our conversation. And we have some upcoming events. Of course, I already told you what we're doing today. Mark your calendars. We're going to continue on this industrial policy in Northeast Asia sort of theme in 2 weeks from now with Mariko Togashi, who is a research fellow at IISS in London. And before that, she worked on Wall Street and was in charge of tearing apart supply chains, especially in Northeast Asia. And so she probably knows more about the semiconductor supply chains than anybody I know, at least. So that should be interesting. And then the last session of the year will be with Professor Jessamine Abel from Penn State, who wrote a very interesting book about the history of the Shinkansen. She's a historian, and will take us back to the early 1960s when Japan started the Shinkansen. All right, so with that, let me end my slides. And here we are. The room has filled up a little bit, so there she is, Dr. Mireya Solís. Thank you, Mireya, for joining me. This is fantastic.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with all of you.
So let me introduce you briefly. Most of the audience might know you, but so Mireya Solís is the director of the Center of East Asian Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. I think I already said that. She's also the Knight Chair in Japan Studies. And before she joined Brookings, a long time ago, more than a decade, she was professor of political science at Brandeis University and American University. She holds a BA in international relations from El Colegio de Mexico. I don't know whether I did that well, I tried. And an MA and PhD from Harvard University. She has more than 50 publications on trade, FDI, the Japanese state, multinationals, trade agreements. She probably knows more about the CPTPP than most of us ever care to know. And that might be one of the topics here today, actually, because today we want to talk about your new book, Mireya. So this is very exciting. It's a fantastic book. So why don't you take a few minutes and tell us what's in the book, and then we'll launch a conversation from there.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. And it's such a pleasure to be in the Japan Zoominar. I have to say I'm a regular watcher, so I'm delighted to come back and talk about my book. I think you can hear me okay, right? Yeah, okay. So then let me just start with some brief opening comments and basically to tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book, what is the main argument, and what are some of the implications. And I make the case that it's important to understand Japan's trajectory if we want to really understand where the region is going, what the regional architecture that has been built is all about, and also has important implications in thinking through US-Asia strategy. But let me first start with why I write this book. And, it's very clear that for the past 30 years, Japan has experienced profound challenges, demographic decline, slow growth, a deteriorating security environment. And, Japan stumbled, and it was a very sharp fall, precisely because the assumption before then, when Japan had these troubles in the 1990s, had been that Japan would only continue to grow. And that turned out to be, of course, a faulty assumption, but it was very much ingrained. In the past, the word miracle had been used to talk about Japan's economic performance. And when Japan stumbled and its political leaders could not find solutions, decisive actions to restart the economy and find its way in this new geopolitical environment, then I think this idea that Japan was in structural decline began to set in. And, there is this frame that has become very, very widely used of the lost decades. And there is truth to it, and that's why it has taken root. But I feel that we have been overusing it in trying to then think about Japan. And my concern is that when we hear the lost decades, most folks stop thinking about Japan, because in many ways they believe that this means that Japan has not changed, and therefore that the story of Japan over the last 30 years is one of a stagnation across the board. So the country is not interesting if you think that it's just going to become less relevant. And this is problematic because it's actually inaccurate. And when you actually take the time to go over what has been happening in many different dimensions over this period of time, what I find is that there's a lot of change in all areas, whether it's the rules of political competition, whether it's the way in which businesses are organized, whether it's the way in which the businesses are going and trying to retool and capture new markets, the way in which government decision-making operates, and certainly the direction of Japanese diplomacy. Now, not all change has been positive, not all solutions have been found, and the country continues to deal with some very significant challenges. But in parsing through all these changes, Ulrike, I came to the realization that there were two important messages that I think were not emphasized enough, and I think that make the Japan story interesting, one. And one is, of course, that Japan has become more relevant, not less, to many more countries. So what Japan has gone through actually is an important point of information for many countries that now face similar challenges. And this is not just about the demographic decline, because that is a very obvious arena that many people have remarked on. Now we have scores of countries, and certainly China, going through a process of demographic decline, the contraction of the working age population, all of that. That's, I think, better noted. But there are other areas where Japan's experience is interesting and when Japan actually is doing well. And that is, for example, its adjustment to economic globalization, a story that I think has not been told enough, and there are important lessons there. But also, I think it's important to look at how Japan, being geographically proximate to China, has dealt with the rise of this military and economic power. And again, these are important experiences that we should be factoring in when we try to think through how we deal with similar challenges. And in my mind, the second other big message that I would like to convey with the book is that I would make the case that there's an interesting puzzle at the center of all this. And that is that if you accept the proposition, which I think is very true, that Japan has experienced a loss of relative capabilities because of protracted deflation, because of demographic contraction, and because neighbors around Japan have been building up their militaries, have become more assertive. Nevertheless, or despite of that, how can Japan be more important, more consequential, an actor with more agency in the geopolitics of this very important region? And I think that's what the core of the book is trying to get at. So let me then very briefly describe what is the argument and implications. To find clues as to why Japan is more proactive and consequential, I realized that I think it's important to look both at how Japan has changed and how its environment has changed. And this may sound very simplistic, But I think it's true that Japan's social and political stability enabled more proactive foreign policy. And what I found is that I couldn't really explain Japan's new international role without connecting the dots to domestic developments. And that's why I had to, venture into new territory. And I did this with trepidation and look at, the evolution of Japan's political system, the health of its democracy, how Japan adjusting to foreign workers, a host of domestic issues that were not really what I was used to studying, but I think are an important part of the story. And very briefly, if I were to highlight two changes domestically and one change internationally, I would say that what's really significant and interesting is that the populist way that has afflicted many countries in the West, that has torn them apart because of polarization, because of giving voice to economic nationalism, to an inward orientation, has missed Japan. And why is that? And the book tries to enumerate a number of reasons why Japan's social cohesion and adjustment to economic globalization still makes a difference in how the country has dealt with these challenges. And the other, I think, important change over time is that we finally saw the rise of executive political leadership. Japan used to be the land of the Iron Triangles, with very weak prime ministers, were mostly faction balancers, right? And it was very difficult to have whole of government strategic thinking and see it through. And what we saw because of reforms in political reforms, administrative reforms, is that now you have a very powerful prime ministerial office and whole of government decision-making structures, which did not occur in the past. And this is important because Japan's strategic environment has deteriorated sharply. And I can go on, but basically it's the rise of China, growing China-Russia ties, the intensification of tension in the hotspots in the region, the Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan Straits, and of course now the disruptions and the conflict in the Middle East. And therefore you have the emergence of great power competition with a more assertive China and with a United States that seems less predictable, and Japan therefore needs to step up. Now, how can you do more with less? And that's another important argument of the book. And the idea that I developed is that Japan was able to do more by developing a strategy, of connectivity. And the idea is that Japan began first, it cut its teeth in the area where it's more comfortable, which is economic engagement. And Japan was able to finally step out and become a champion of free trade, but also used more comprehensively and with greater thought its infrastructure finance. And from there, Japan went on to implement important national security reforms, but also to embark in a very active security diplomacy. And Japan became a network power. And it has enhanced security cooperation with countries like India, Australia, the UK, and just this week we saw in the Philippines and Malaysia. Now, in this way, I think Japan is reshaping the Indo-Pacific. And if we want to look at some of the most important initiatives in the recent past, in many ways, Japan is connected to them. This is not the story of a country that's going into obscurity. It's a country that is doing more with less. And just to stop here, I would just say that for the United States, actually cooperating with Japan in Asia has become more important. There is some convergence in how Japan and the United States think of the China challenge, but there are differences also in China policy. And Japan has led in, for example, articulating the free and open Indo-Pacific, in advocating for Quad cooperation, but also now in economic security. I think that there is some foresight on how Japan is thinking about this very important arena. And these are areas where Japan and the United States cooperate actively. So why don't I stop there? And I welcome the conversation. I think you're muted.
I was trying to be on my best behavior. So thank you. Fantastic. Lots to chew on. So we have the domestic story, we have the foreign story, and both are pointing you to this title, Quiet Leadership. And so let me maybe ask a few questions that dig a little bit deeper into some of these aspects you make. And then the audience, you should feel free to type your questions into the Q&A as we go. it's heartening to hear that you talk about what's great about Japanese politics, but what are some of the challenges? Japan is suddenly one of the most stable, predictable democracies in the world, right? It used to be. I remember the times when there was a new prime minister every year, and somehow this has completely changed. Also, the personas of these prime ministers seem to be different. Right. And there's a lot of marketing, and there's some good wordsmithing and labeling and so forth. Can you talk a little bit more about that part? So what's strong and where the strengths come from, but then also maybe some of the challenges that from a Japanese perspective, I don't know, we might find things wrong, but what is the conversation within Japan? What's wrong with or what are the challenges to the democracy?
Thank you, Ulrike. And those are very important questions. And I think that Japan, the story about Japanese politics looks more optimistic by comparison, right? By what we're witnessing in the United States, by the challenging of, electoral integrity and, someone refusing to accept defeat. And that's just one example of what we're going through in the United States. So Japan is not experiencing this populist turmoil, rage, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have very significant problems. And there's some troubling signs about the health of its democracy. And every country has its own challenges. So what I find very interesting is that, Japan is not politically polarized. And the opposite seems to be the troubles ahead. And what I mean by that is that we can have a case, I think, of apathy and disengagement and waning democratic dynamism. That, in my mind, are some of the more significant challenges that the Japanese democracy faces. Where is this coming from? Well, you remember that when the electoral reforms were passed, there was the hope that Japan might transition to a two-party system where there would be competition of ideas, competing tickets, and that this is a way in which you inject vitality, you have channels of accountability, and therefore that this was a desirable goal. This did not pan out, and Japan, had a moment where there was an opposition party, the Democratic Party of Japan, 2009. Now seems like a long time ago, but the party that came into office and advertised regime change, and that did not go very well. And since then, what we find is that the opposition has remained fragmented, that it has been difficult to recuperate the trust from the voters. And the way I phrase this in the book is, what are the downsides of having politics without real alternatives? So on the one hand, stability is very positive. And the fact that you don't have this volatility and that you can have consistent policy, certainly in the foreign policy realm, that's all very good. But if stability comes from the weakness of the opposition parties, that is troublesome. And in particular, if it comes from voters deciding that there's not a lot for them to be very engaged in the political process. And what we've seen in the last decade is that the turnout during elections has been actually low and sometimes gets lower. And that cannot be good. Or there are some opinion polls that the book also cites when you ask, what about the participatory element of democracy? And many people are not that interested in becoming very active in these activities because they don't see what can be the result, what can change. So I would say that that's a challenge for Japan going forward. You mentioned the time that when there was a lot of instability at the top and one prime minister a year, and that certainly was not a good time for Japan because nobody can solve or tackle the national problems if they don't have time to stay on. Then we had this very different dynamic, the long tenure of Prime Minister Abe. And now that when Abe resigned and later on with the tragic assassination of Abe, I think it has been up to what happens to the successors. What happens? Can they retain, this political stability? Can they be deft political managers? And chances are that the LDP will continue to win elections because, again, the opposition parties are not very appealing. And you look at opinion support levels and they're in the single digits. But it takes more than just, not losing an election. And I think that the next challenge really is for Prime Minister Kishida is in a complicated situation. His opinion support levels are not good. Now according to some polls, they're below 30%. I think he's doing great in foreign policy, but I don't think that he has found yet a compelling message for the Japanese audience, especially when it comes to the domestic economic problems, the cost of living, and so forth.
Thank you. I always thought that these support ratings in Japan are actually where the voters say, I'm unhappy. And then when it's time to vote, they vote for the LDP regardless, right? So we need to take these support ratings with a little bit of a grain of salt, right? It's not a predictor of any electoral outcomes, right? But people are unhappy in any event. So
Yes.
So David wants to challenge you a little bit, and I can't resist the temptation to read this out. You said the iron triangle is no longer that powerful, but he wonders the bureaucrats are still part of that triangle, and they're unelected, and they're still making the policies. And so what has changed? I mean, the triangle itself is still there, is it not? Or is what's the change in that power play?
Well, thank you, David. And it's always good to have it's nice to get a question that to respond to like this. I would say that it's not that the iron triangles have disappeared, but it's that in some critical areas, they seem not to have the same clout that they had in the past. And my comment is mostly informed what I have seen happening on trade liberalization and the agricultural lobby. And I think this is a really powerful story, because this is how Japan basically began to become this new champion of free trade. And that was just the beginning, I think, of this connectivity strategy that later on morphed to other arenas. And what happened in the past is that the agricultural lobby very much had veto power over what kind of trade negotiations the country could participate in. And that meant that nothing that really challenged them. And Japan was therefore almost about to miss the boat. It was one of the countries that came last to negotiate trade agreements, and they would negotiate trade agreements that would be very modest, very mediocre in some cases. And certainly Japan could not even think about the big leagues like the CPTPP, and that moment, the TPP. So I think that's what happened, that you have the ability of the prime minister to avoid those veto powers. This does not mean, this is Japan, this does not mean that everybody was just marginalized and no one was looked after. If you look at the way in which Japan joined the TPP and how it concluded the negotiation, it made sure that some core interests of agriculture were respected. You have the 5 sacred commodities, and there was a little bit of liberalization there, but nevertheless, they received preferential special treatment. So again, it's gradual change. There's no revolution here, but nevertheless, it does mean that the horizons of what is possible changed. And I think that's an important development.
So I would add also that the 2 other things that are happening is that the Kante, the cabinet office, has taken over the power of who gets promoted to the top positions in the ministries, which means that the bureaucrats really are now pleasing the Kante, if you wanted to be cynical about it, or at least it means that the bureaucracy is more in line with larger policy goals, or however elegantly you want to phrase that. The other thing I think that's happening is that business is no longer as interested in working with the government as closely, because the nature of industrial policy has changed, I think. So that opens a whole can of worms. And in fact, the audience, there are a couple of questions on democracy and the young people not voting and so forth, but let me go with the majority of questions that we got from the audience, which is about the foreign policy aspects of you're talking about, right? So the first thing is, and Robbie helps us connect the dots. He wonders whether the upcoming change in the Diet electoral system, apparently there's a new electoral system for the Diet, might have an impact on Japan's foreign policy.
What does he have in mind by the?
I'm actually not sure what the electoral thing is, but my guess is he's wondering whether you see any. So he follows. We follow Japan every day. Is what we're seeing today going to change at all? So what is determining Japan's foreign policy? Is it sort of domestic policies where voters' wishes get reflected, or is it actually something where Japan is doing what's good for the nation, however that's determined? And so how are the two connected?
Yeah.
Because in the United States, I don't think American voters care much about foreign policy. I mean, do we? I mean, do they? It's third order, maybe?
Yeah, well, my sense is that Japanese voters are similar, that they care mostly about the situation at home and they care mostly about, and I think that's why, with the cost of living going up, they're not very happy and they're not very convinced with what Prime Minister Kishida has offered in terms of the new capitalism. So I think that when it comes to foreign policy, I think that what we're seeing is, first of all, the greater institutional capability to identify strategic challenges and come up with whole of government project solutions, ideas. And, in 2013 was the first time that Japan issued a national security strategy. And more recently, at the end of 2022, you have the second iteration. So when you tell me what is driving Japanese foreign policy, I think first and foremost, I think the strategic challenges, the fact that Japan is in a very, very dangerous neighborhood, and where you see forces that are eroding a rules-based system, increasing, intensifying. And Japan is a status quo power. Japan is a country that, like many others, thrives on predictability and stability, and certainly with certain rules that allow the country's security and prosperity to continue. I think that Japan is also responding to a very different China that, from what had been the traditional view of China. You have a China that, has integrated very successfully to the world economy and grew very rapidly, but where now you see centralization of power, where you see the comeback of state capitalism policies, and where you see a more assertive China pushing for expansive claims in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and a China that is now identified by the United States, the security anchor of Japan, as a pacing challenge. So I think that's a big factor, a stimulus for where Japanese policy is going. And the other one, quite frankly, I think, Ulrike, you mentioned this, is the United States also. Because, we have, from a point of view of Japan, I think the United States has been experiencing a lot of changes in its policy towards the region and certainly towards China. So for a long time, you would hear many Japanese security experts who were frustrated that the United States was not waking up quickly enough to this assertive China. And they were very worried about Japan and China and the United States becoming too close. And then when we're so far away from that situation, and there was real concern during the Trump years that the United States might move to too hot, defining the relationship in zero-sum terms, not being very systematic and well coordinated. And with the Biden administration, you find that there is more systematic laying out of what are the strategic objectives, but it's not necessarily always an easy combination for Japan because it comes with a lot of America First economic policies. So that's the set of challenges that I think are motivating the Japanese government when it's thinking through. My last comment, if I may, is that there's a lot of continuity from one prime minister after the other in the Abe and post-Abe. So they're all sticking to the essential parameters of the free and open Indo-Pacific, the Quad, because it works for Japan. It has been a very successful strategy. But I would say that it's going to be harder. It's going to be harder to be this network power when the world is fragmenting, when you are now also advocating for national security controls to economic transactions. So what happens to your broad integration push? And when, there are more expectations about what Japan will do, can do, And, we're seeing it also now with the Middle East and Japan hosting this week the G7 foreign ministers meeting. It's not easy to be in the limelight. And I think that the question for Prime Minister Kishida is what will be new given the ongoing trends in world politics.
So I got a clarification on that electoral change. So the cities will be represented more. And we'll get more seats. So the cities get more seats in the rural areas.
Yes.
And presumably that empowers stronger foreign policy, because I don't know. I'm just assuming that the cities are might have a stronger interest in. So Tokyo alone will get 5 more seats. So there's a lot of the more Tokyo representation. And we had 4 weeks ago we had a speaker talking about how local politics are very much concerning old people and daycare and sort of domestic topics, but the cities might be a little bit different. So staying on this topic is super interesting. What specific defense and security reforms, I guess, help Japan become a networking power? So maybe Japan has always been a networking power. I'm not sure, but you're saying in your book that it has become one. So what is underlying that shift to more leadership in the region, other than the obvious threat and the fact that you mentioned already that the United States is less reliable, and so we've got to do it. But Japan seems to actually proactively seeking that leadership.
Yeah. So what I have in mind is that, I think that in the post-war era, for a very long time, Japan was passive on trade and avoided a very overt political role in the region because there was still a lot of mistrust of Japan. And, you think back to the mid-1970s, early 1970s, when you had these riots in Southeast Asia during the tour of Prime Minister Tanaka, and then the desire to be more attuned with the views of Southeast Asia with the Fukuda Doctrine. But this was not a Japan that was putting forward a blueprint for the regional order. And this was a Japan that was trying to minimize its commitments under the US-Japan alliance. And it was this, the availability of the bases, and that's it. And, there was not a lot of discussion with the allies about how you operationalize alliance and can we do more. And I think that over time, this has changed. It's not all Abe. I think that Abe capitalized on existing trends, but the fact that he stayed in power for so long enabled him to see some of these reforms. And when you ask me what reforms, well, I'm thinking about the reinterpretation of the right of collective self-defense under the Constitution that opened the possibility for greater alliance dialogue and deepening. I think that Japanese security planners have been more prepared to discuss, not to commit, but to discuss what to do in case of regional contingencies. And, we have to temper our expectations about what Japan can do, because Japan still operates with the strictest limitations on the use of force abroad. Nothing like that. Nothing on that end has changed. Article 9 remains intact. But nevertheless, the fact that Japan and the United States can now talk about these different contingencies is a difference from the past, and not an institutional reform. But I would say that the focus of Japanese diplomacy has shifted because Japan was not signing reciprocal access agreements with other countries where you could have, easier deployment of troops, where you can think about joint training. And this is happening on many different countries. So clearly, Japan has one ally. There's only one treaty ally, and that is the United States. But Japan is developing other relationships with like-minded countries that I think it's interesting because it can help Japan be part of this broader, network security arrangement. But also it's a hedging, I think, or a risk minimization strategy because the United States is less reliable. So you also want to have other security collaboration structures out.
Yeah, so are the US and Japan on the same page as it comes to economic security? And that's a second question, and or China?
Yes and no. I think in the broadest sense, there's a strategic convergence. And I think that both are very concerned about the direction of China and how China is trying to, use very sensitive technologies to advance its military modernization plans, because both Japan and the United States could be at the end of, could be targets if the worst were to happen. So clearly they have a concern with making sure that these very sensitive technologies are handled with care. I think that Japan, among US partners in the region, is the one country that is very prepared in public statements. When Japanese prime ministers visit the American president, they have called out explicitly China's coercive behavior. And I think that both would really like to see the diminishment of the reduction of over-dependence on China and a strengthening of supply chains. Those are, I think, areas of convergence. But I think that there's still very significant gaps between the two allies that need to be reconciled. One is that, Washington now speaks the lingo of de-risking. And I think that Tokyo has been pushing for de-risking without necessarily using that term earlier. The question is, does
so say that again, de-risking?
De-risking.
De-risking without? Yeah.
De-risking.
So they both talk about de-risking. Okay.
So, I think Tokyo has been trying to de-risk from China earlier, and now Washington has caught on, and that's certainly a term that actually the Europeans seem to have been able to pass on to the Americans. But it's not clear that the Americans will succeed in this de-risking effort, because they have a lot of restrictions on many different fronts. And one difference is, for example, we should not forget the US-China trade war, because those tariffs largely are still in place, and they still affect a very substantial amount of trade between the United States and China. There's also differences in how export controls are devised. And for example, Japan's export control policies do not target a specific nation. And this is not what the United States is doing with its newest export control policies on semiconductors that explicitly target China. So, there's been negotiations to try to align on export control policy, but there's always that difference that Japan will not go and deliberately target China. And the biggest difference, I think, is that Japan still makes the point, and I think they're right in here, that if you really want to diminish overdependence on China, and if you really want to disseminate different economic standards, then the CPTPP is still more attractive than what the United States gives it credit for. So that's still a very important difference between the two countries, and it's not going away.
So we're getting a few questions on the title of your book. So let me read Sung Hyun's question. I would like to ask what the difference between the United States leadership, which is not quiet, and Japan's quiet leadership. What makes Japan's leadership quiet but effective? And also, is that a matter of choice, of strategic choice, or is it because Japan is a little brother, or what makes the leadership quiet?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I get a lot of questions, and there are a number of reasons why I chose that title. First of all, because I feel that some of Japan's strengths go under the radar because they don't make the headlines. Who's going to write a story about social cohesion, political stability? They're not like attention grabbing, right? So I think that that's also part of the issue. But I feel also that it is quiet leadership because bottom line is a diplomatic endeavor, right? Japan is using diplomacy. And it's not, Japan does have very significant economic heft, and it's also it has a large army, navy, their self-defense forces are not minor. And I think we should also not lose sight of that. But nevertheless, I think the network power is coming fundamentally from this diplomatic push. And that's why I use the term quiet. I also feel that, and this is a perennial discussion, I think, when it comes to Japanese foreign policy as to whether the country is not, whether it flies too much under the radar and whether that's a problem. And There's a very interesting opinion polls done by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. They asked, experts on foreign policy in Southeast Asia about a number of different things. And there's always a question as to which country is most important for the region's geopolitics and economy. And the two countries are always that come up, not surprises, China and the United States. Which countries do you trust less? Again, China and by far, and then the United States. Which country do you trust more? Japan. Which country do you think is helpful in helping your nation navigate this strategic rivalry? Japan. So I think that that's interesting because Japan might not be, for different reasons, might not be seen as the most important when it comes to the engines of the economic and geopolitical dynamics. But there is something there about the consistency of Japanese quiet diplomacy that I think earns trust points.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, I think that quiet suits Japan. It's a quiet place. I mean, it's like, it's a very self-deprecating sort of place now, and being in the background so Padma is going to put you to the task here, and this might get a little bit into the weeds, but I think the question is worth discussing. Definitely, what influence does Japan really have quietly on the region? Can you give us a few examples where you see the outcomes of this newly emerging quiet leadership?
Sure. I mean, and I don't want to keep using the same examples, but certainly the survival of the CPTPP, which is arguably the most ambitious trade agreement in the region, you cannot explain that without Japan. When the United States pulled out, everybody thought the agreement is dead. I remember making the rounds in different policy circles in Washington, and I was carrying an op-ed I had just written, the TPP is dead. Long live the TPP, making the case that it was Japan's turn. And I was told, this is impossible. Japan would never step up to the plate. So I think that's a very demonstrable example. The other one is actually, talk about loud leadership, China. I think that China over-advertises sometimes on what it does. And the Belt and Road Initiative is perhaps an interesting example, where sometimes these projects do not pan out all that they were expected to be. And again, sometimes people don't realize that when it comes to infrastructure finance in Southeast Asia, there is no other peer competitor to China other than Japan, to be quite frank. Because when you look at the numbers, what the United States and Australia are offering is very, very small. And yes, China is still a little bit ahead, but not by much. And therefore, the idea that you can provide alternatives to developing countries, infrastructure finance, I would say that's also another example of quiet leadership.
Yeah, definitely. So, but then the question becomes, right, and several people have asked this, okay, so the recipients of this leadership, Southeast Asian countries, the Indo-Pacific, and it's beautiful. What do they think about Japan's emergence as a quiet leader? I mean, is this welcomed? Is it a necessity? Are there, is it good to get the money? But or another way of phrasing the story is actually, how reliable are these new friends?
Well, they're not necessarily new, first of all, because Japan and ASEAN are about to celebrate their 50th anniversary. So, there's a lot of, I'm sorry, my dog is making a comment here. But so it's not necessarily new. And I imagine that the views of Japan vary in the region. There's not one single view. I also feel that perhaps it depends the point in time when you ask this question. Certainly, when the change of narrative from Japan unstoppable economic engine to Japan basket case, I don't think that was a moment in which Japan would get a lot of confidence votes. But now that, despite the difficulties, Japan manages to be consistent in offering this economic assistance, in stitching the region together, I think that the role that Japan plays with the United States in thinking through regional deterrence or economic security frameworks, that also makes Japan, I think, more relevant to the region. I think that in general, public opinion polls in Southeast Asia about Japan are actually quite favorable. The situation is very different from what I described in the early 1970s. And again, we're beginning to see, a change in regional perspectives or perceptions of where China is heading. So again, this is all the different pieces of the puzzle also keep being reallocated. And if China is going to tone down its Belt and Road Initiative, well, what are the other alternatives out there? So, I think that there's a lot to be watching for.
So we're getting a few questions on the United States. They all start with, of course, your book is about Japan. However, so if you want to defer those, that's fine. But let me ask them because I think they're to the point. And on both sides of sort of the spectrum, the first question is: is the U.S. doing anything right vis-a-vis Japan and Asia? Because Anne asked because she's heard you say a lot of sort of doubtful things about or negative things about the United States. So that's on the one hand. So what is the U.S. doing right? And then on the other hand, so we've mentioned, both of us have mentioned several times now that the U.S. has become unreliable, but it's actually reliably going in one direction. The question is, right? So the new Speaker of the House is very clearly opposed to all manners of spending, has no background in foreign affairs, and then the ultimate question of this is, what does Japan do if Donald Trump becomes the next president?
Well, I'm skeptical of, the economic strategy of the U.S. administrations in the recent past, but I do want to give credit to the Biden administration for really developing a effective Indo-Pacific strategy when it comes to the security cooperation front, and really addressing some really profound challenges in the international system. I don't want to imagine if we had had the same challenges of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the current Israel-Hamas conflict, where we could be at if we did not have this more competent team who has been building relationships. So yes, on the economic side, there are some issues that rankle our partners or allies, or some disappointment that we're not doing more. But you don't see the bullying of allies, them questioning our alliance commitments in the way in which we saw during the Trump years. And I think that the United States also has done well in terms of building these new unilateralism on the security front, and thinking of networked arrangements. So it's not just enough to be with the hub and spoke alliance system, but what we're beginning to see is these unilaterals, connected tissue. And I think where there's a lot of credit, I would say, it's not just the United States, certainly South Korea and Japan, and the president of South Korea in particular took a lot of initiative in addressing the bilateral friction with Japan. But nevertheless, I would not underestimate the role that the United States has had in propping up that trilateral initiative. So when you look at the Camp David Accords, there's really significant stuff there. Whether it would last, will it be institutionalized? There are no guarantees, and the domestic politics are going to be unwieldy. We know that going forward. But it's nevertheless striking when you consider where we were at just a few years ago and the deterioration of Japan, South Korea, and now the realm of possibilities, that Camp David Accord, thinking about economic security coordination, thinking about a mechanism to consult among the three parties when there's a major regional crisis, and a common readout of some of the strategic problems that create concern for the three parties. So I think those are things that the U.S. government, the current U.S. government, is doing right.
Yeah. So we have a few people on this podcast that work in finance, and the question had to come up, right? how about the yen? So the yen is what it is, but it will eventually will affect policy. So for instance, would Japan have to cut back on its defense spending if the yen is where it is? So to what extent does the economic situation play into this whole quiet leadership, or or Japan's plans to be maybe more self-sufficient in its own positioning in the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, and this is a very tough situation, and the book does not want to hide the challenges, right? The idea is that Japan is in a difficult place, and it has found some ways to do more. It's not that the picture is rosy by any means, and certainly I think when you think about finding sustainable a path to sustainable growth, addressing the erosion in real wages, finding new sources of productivity, giving real economic opportunity with equal pay to a lot of women. Those are all issues where Japan is facing difficulties, and they will continue to be very impactful for how people feel about themselves, whether they have good standard of living, how they feel about their overall situation. And certainly in my sense, I was in Tokyo, maybe I came back 10 days ago, and my sense is that people are worried the inflation and the low cost of yen, they feel very proximate. And people, obviously, the thought of going abroad with the yen what it is, you don't feel very wealthy when that happens. And, I'm not in finance, but I can tell you that certainly Japan is an outlier today when it's by still working with a monetary policy that maintains low interest rates, while the other countries, certainly the United States, has increased its interest rates. And I think that creates some difficulties. All eyes are on when and how might the Bank of Japan begin to taper down this expansionary monetary policy. And that will be certainly a challenge for the government. I think that one of the situations or the critical issues that the government faces is also the fiscal, and the fact that there are more and more demands for limited resources. So during the COVID years, there was a lot of need for the government to step up and provide relief for that. With the low fertility rate, there's an interest in provide some kind of support for young families. And now with the security environment, there is the idea that Japan has embarked or has made a promise to significantly expand its defense expenditures. And one of the points I make in the book is that with the new capitalism, I think that the problem is that many people, or the messaging was that we'll find a harmonious way. And I actually see a lot of fiscal fights, and they're materializing today. And they might, the weak yen and the fiscal fights might influence how Japan walks this commitment to increase its defense expenditure. So, there's no shortage of challenges, but there's been many challenges in the past, and nevertheless, Japan still matters.
So you may have partially just answered my next question, which is actually, so you started us out by saying, well, there's all this narrative about, the stagnant and whatnot, lost so many decades. And yet there's so much change, right? So why do you think this narrative of stagnation is so pervasive?
Well, I think because, I think the general public has not, in some ways, lost interest. I'm not the people like us, the watchers of Japan seminar or the Japan hands, the Japan scholars. But I think that, again, when it feels that it's all bad news or that there's no change, I think that is very difficult. I think it connects to the answer I gave to the quiet, the use of that adjective, that a lot of the strengths go under the radar, and that, a lot of the assets that Japan deploys are in the diplomacy. When, if you're not following these issues, are you going to really pay attention to the new reciprocal access agreement between Japan and Australia? I mean, but these are things that make a difference, right? Or when you're not bombastic in the way in which you provide infrastructure finance or economic assistance. Those all things, I think, mitigate against taking the time to review assumptions and to try to make a different balance of, where the country is at today, and the areas where it struggles, or the areas where it actually is not as afflicted as other countries are.
Yeah, it reminds me of this one of the rules of power. So you have to create your own narrative. And I think the narrative that we hear about Japan these days has been created by Americans who haven't looked in a long time. And when they look at something they knew from the 1980s, and it's no longer there, or it's no longer good, and they say, well, that's not working. And they're not looking at the new things that have come up, or the new developments, the subtle differences, that are actually happening. Of course, countries change. I mean, everybody's changes. So the fact that this narrative that Japan has just lost it and is no longer relevant is an interesting one, right? And the fact that Japan itself doesn't do much about it to change it, I find very interesting.
But I would tell you that when I was in Tokyo, one of the interesting remarks or reactions to my book from a diplomat, when he saw quiet leadership, he said, "We're not quiet anymore." So there's a desire to
show, yes, and I see that too, right? So I think there's now more activity around making sure that the Indo-Pacific is and FOIP is actually identified as a Japanese invention, not an American one, right? And as it is, and Prime Minister Suga, I think, came up with it, if I understand it correctly, and that Japan gets credit where credit is due, which is in things like the various trade agreements and the stabilizing activities that Japan is doing. So it's a super interesting topic. I could go on for hours. However, time is up. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Mireya Solís, for a fabulous conversation about the quiet leadership, or the new quiet leadership, or the old quiet leadership, I don't know, of Japan. And everybody, in 2 weeks from now, we'll continue directionally with this topic when we talk about global supply chain and trade dependencies in the region, in particular, and things like semiconductors and so forth, where we're going to dissect the supply chains and look who's dependent on whom. So thank you all for joining, and stay safe until the next time, which is in 2 weeks, and have a good rest of your day.